The courtroom was silent except for the sound of a cardboard box being placed on the table. Inside that box were envelopes. Old, yellowed, brittle at the corners, some of them held together with tape that had turned amber with age. On the front of each envelope in fading pencil was a date. The oldest one read, 1968. The lawyers for AgriCorp Seed Company, a corporation worth billions, with a legal team flown in from 3 different states, looked at that box the way a man looks at a snake he didn't expect to find in his boot. Because inside those envelopes were seeds. Corn seeds saved by hand, season after season, by a farmer named Walter Hensley and before him his father. AgriCorp had sued Walter for patent infringement. They said he had stolen their genetically engineered seed technology patented in the 1990s, and used it without paying licensing fees. They wanted damages. They wanted his farm. They wanted, more than anything, to make an example out of him so that no other farmer in the country would dare think about saving seeds without paying for the privilege. What they did not expect was for a 68-year-old man in a flannel shirt to stand up in front of a federal judge and prove with paper trails photographs, family journals and seeds preserved for over 50 years, that he had been growing this exact lineage of corn since before their company even existed. This is the story of how a seed, a single, humble seed, became the center of one of the most quietly explosive legal battles in American farming history. And how one farmer's habit of never throwing anything away ended up saving not just his land, but an entire way of life for thousands of farmers who were watching, silently, hoping someone would finally stand up to the corporation that had been suing people like him for decades. To understand how Walter Hensley ended up in that courtroom, you have to go back to a small stretch of farmland in the Midwest, where the Hensley family had been growing corn and soybeans since the years right after the Second World War. Walter's father, Earl Hensley, was not a sentimental man, but he believed in one thing above all else: independence. He did not trust banks more than he had to. He did not trust weathermen. And he certainly did not trust the idea of buying something every single year that he could grow, save, and replant himself. So in 1968, when Earl harvested a particularly strong batch of corn, resistant to a dry spell that had wiped out half the county's yield, he did something farmers had done for thousands of years before him. He set aside the best ears, dried them properly, shelled the kernels by hand, and stored them in the cool, dark cellar beneath the farmhouse. The next spring he planted those exact kernels, and the harvest was even better. Word got around the county. Neighbors started asking Earl for a few ears here and there, offering to trade for other supplies. Slowly, the Hensley corn line became something of a local legend, not because it was flashy, but because it was reliable. It handled drought better than most hybrid seed on the market. It didn't need excessive fertilizer. It was, in the plainest sense, a seed that worked with the land instead of demanding the land bend to it. Walter grew up watching his father do this every single year. Select the best ears, dry them on wire racks in the barn. Shell them by hand in the evenings while listening to the radio. Label the envelopes with the date and the field they came from. Store them in the cellar, where the temperature stayed cool and dry year-round. By the time Walter took over the farm in the early 1990s, this process wasn't just a habit, it was a ritual. He kept his father's old envelopes as a kind of archive, a family record stretching back over 2 decades, and he continued the tradition with the same discipline, adding new envelopes every single harvest. He had no idea that this simple habit, the habit of never throwing anything away, would one day be the only thing standing between him and losing everything he owned. While the Hensleys were quietly saving seeds in their cellar, something enormous was shifting in American agriculture, something most small farmers didn't fully understand until it was already reshaping their entire industry. In the 1980s and 1990s, biotechnology companies began developing genetically modified seeds engineered to resist certain herbicides or pests. These seeds promised higher yields with less labor. But there was a catch buried in the fine print. Farmers who purchased these seeds were required to sign contracts agreeing they would not save any seeds from their harvest to replant the following year. Every single season, farmers had to buy new seed from the company. This was a radical departure from thousands of years of agricultural tradition, in which saving seed from one harvest to plant the next was simply what farming was. Seed saving wasn't just practical; for many farming families it was cultural. It was how a farm passed knowledge, resilience, and identity from one generation to the next. But the big seed companies had patents now, and patents meant lawsuits. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, these companies built entire legal divisions dedicated to investigating farmers suspected of patent infringement. They hired private investigators. They tested crops in fields without always making clear how the testing was conducted. They sent threatening letters, and when a farmer refused to settle or simply couldn't afford to, they sued. Thousands of farmers, many of them elderly, many of them running small family operations, found themselves facing lawsuits from corporations with legal budgets larger than their farm's total value. Most settled quietly, terrified of the cost of fighting back, even when they believed they had done nothing wrong. Some lost their farms entirely. It was into this climate, a climate where the odds were stacked overwhelmingly against the small farmer, that AgriCorp's lawyers arrived at Walter Hensley's front gate one autumn morning with a certified letter in hand. Walter remembers the exact day it arrived. He had just come in from checking the soybean rows when his wife, Carol, handed him an envelope with a return address he didn't recognize. Official letterhead. A law firm's name in bold serif font. The letter accused Walter Hensley of unlawfully using and replanting a genetically patented corn variety belonging to AgriCorp Seed Company, in direct violation of federal patent law. It claimed that samples taken from a field adjacent to his property had tested positive for AgriCorp's patented genetic trait, a trait his corn should not have contained, since he had never purchased AgriCorp seed in his life. The letter demanded he cease all use of the disputed seed line, pay a settlement fee that could run into six figures, and allow AgriCorp representatives to inspect and destroy any remaining stock of the seed in question. Walter read the letter twice. Then he read it a third time. Then he set it down on the kitchen table and said something Carol would repeat for years afterward. They're going to try to take Daddy's corn. The idea that his corn, the same lineage his father had painstakingly selected and preserved since 1968, could somehow contain a genetic trait that had been engineered and patented decades later seemed almost absurd to Walter. But he understood immediately how dangerous the situation was. Cross-pollination between fields is common in corn farming. Pollen travels on the wind, sometimes for miles, and can settle onto neighboring crops without a farmer's knowledge or consent. If even a small percentage of his crop had been unintentionally cross-pollinated by a nearby farm growing AgriCorp's patented seed, the company's legal team could argue that his entire seed stock was now contaminated with their patented trait, regardless of the fact that he never purchased, planted, or intended to use their product in the first place. This was, in fact, exactly the kind of case AgriCorp had won before. Farmers who found patented genetic material in their fields, even unintentionally, even through no fault of their own, had been successfully sued in the past. Courts had ruled in several precedent-setting cases that intent didn't necessarily matter. If the patented trait was present in a farmer's crop and that farmer replanted seed from that crop, it could be considered a violation. AgriCorp was betting Walter would do what most farmers did, panic, hire a local lawyer he couldn't really afford, and eventually settle just to make the nightmare end. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Walter did something AgriCorp's legal team likely did not expect. He didn't panic. He didn't immediately call a lawyer. Instead, he went down to the cellar. He hadn't been down there in months. Carol usually handled the seed inventory now that his knees weren't what they used to be, but he needed to see something with his own eyes. He needed to confirm what he already knew in his bones. The cellar was exactly as it had always been. Wooden shelves lining the walls, each one holding rows of carefully labeled envelopes and small burlap sacks. And there, near the back, in a section his father had built decades earlier, were envelopes so old the paper had turned the color of weak tea. He pulled one out gently, careful not to tear it. The pencil writing was faded but still legible. Hensley Corn, Northfield, fall 1968. He held that envelope for a long time. Walter knew this wasn't going to be a fight he could win with emotion alone. AgriCorp had genetic testing, patent law, and an army of lawyers. What Walter had was history, but history needed to be proven, documented, and defended in a court of law. And he understood that this was going to be an uphill and expensive battle. He hired a lawyer, not a big city firm, but a sharp, determined attorney named Diane Ferris, who had a reputation in the region for representing family farms in disputes against larger agricultural interests. When Walter told her about the cellar, about the decades of dated envelopes, about the labeled sacks going back to 1968, she reportedly went quiet for a moment before saying, "If even half of what you're telling me is true and we can prove it, this isn't just going to be a defense. This could be a landmark." Diane understood something crucial. This case wasn't only about whether Walter's corn contained trace amounts of AgriCorp's patented gene. It was about a much bigger question that had never been fully answered in court. Could a farmer be held liable for patent infringement on a seed lineage that predated the patent itself by decades, especially when there was no evidence he had ever purchased, planted, or intentionally used the company's product? The battle lines were drawn. AgriCorp wasn't going to back down easily. They had a reputation to protect, and letting one farmer successfully fight back could open the door for hundreds of others to do the same. And Walter wasn't going to back down either, because this wasn't just about money. It was about his father's legacy and about a way of farming that had sustained his family for 2 generations. The months leading up to the trial were grueling. AgriCorp's legal team requested extensive documentation, demanded access to Walter's fields for additional testing, and deposed nearly every member of his family, including Carol and their adult children. Diane Ferris and her small team worked to build a case around 3 central pillars. The seed envelopes themselves, dated as far back as 1968, needed to be authenticated. Diane brought in a forensic document examiner who confirmed that the paper, ink, and pencil markings on the oldest envelopes were consistent with materials manufactured and used decades earlier, long before AgriCorp's patented gene had even been developed in a laboratory. Diane worked with an independent agricultural geneticist to test samples from the oldest preserved seed stock. If Walter's claim was accurate, the seeds saved from decades ago, grown from lineage untouched by modern genetic engineering, should show a genetic profile distinct from AgriCorp's patented trait, even if some more recent harvests had picked up trace contamination through wind-blown cross-pollination from neighboring farms. Neighbors who had traded seed with the Hensley family over the decades were tracked down. Several were elderly themselves, but still sharp enough to testify clearly about receiving Hensley corn seed as far back as the 1970s and 1980s, long before AgriCorp's patent even existed. One neighbor, a woman in her 80s named Ruth Callahan, still had her own family's records of a seed trade with Earl Hensley dated 1979, complete with a handwritten note thanking him for some of that good drought corn. Diane also uncovered something else during her research, something that would become crucial to the case. AgriCorp's own patent filings, submitted in the 1990s, contained a description of the novel genetic trait they claimed to have engineered. When cross-referenced with the genetic testing on Walter's oldest preserved seed samples, there were meaningful differences. Walter's older seed stock, predating the patent, did not carry the specific engineered marker AgriCorp claimed as their intellectual property. It was, at its core, simply good old-fashioned corn, selectively bred by a careful farmer for resilience, not genetically engineered in a lab. The implication was significant. Any trace of AgriCorp's patented trait found in Walter's more recent crops was almost certainly the result of unintentional cross-pollination from a neighboring farm, not because Walter had ever used AgriCorp seed or replanted anything derived from it. And critically, his original decades-old seed lineage, the one he had preserved continuously since 1968, remained provably free of their patented genetic material. As the case dragged toward trial, Walter faced pressures beyond the courtroom. Legal fees mounted quickly, and though Diane worked with him on a reduced arrangement, the cost of expert witnesses, genetic testing, and document verification put a serious strain on the family's finances. There were whispers around the county, too. Some neighbors were sympathetic, quietly rooting for the Hensleys and sharing their own frustrations with the growing dominance of major seed companies over local agriculture. Others were more cautious, worried that publicly supporting Walter might draw unwanted attention from AgriCorp's legal department, which had a reputation for aggressive tactics against anyone who challenged them. AgriCorp, for its part, offered Walter a settlement partway through the proceedings, a common tactic in these kinds of cases. The offer would have required him to pay a reduced fine, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and agree never to publicly discuss the case or the company's practices again. It also would have required him to allow AgriCorp representatives onto his property to inspect and, if they deemed necessary, destroy his seed stock, including, potentially, the very envelopes his father had preserved since 1968. Walter refused. "They can offer me all the money in the world," he reportedly told Diane, "but once we let them come in and destroy Daddy's corn, we don't get it back. That's not something you can put a price on." It was a significant risk. If the case went to trial and he lost, he could face far greater financial damages than the settlement offer, and there was no guarantee the court would rule in his favor. But Walter had made his decision, and Carol stood firmly beside him. The trial finally began on a cold morning, with the county courthouse busier than it had been in years. Word had spread through the farming community, and dozens of local farmers packed into the gallery to watch, some driving hours to be there. For many of them, this case represented something much bigger than one man's corn. It represented a chance to see whether the small farmer could ever truly stand a chance against a corporate giant in matters of seed rights and patent law. AgriCorp's legal team presented their case first, methodically walking the jury through the patent filings, the genetic testing results showing trace presence of their proprietary trait in samples taken from Walter's more recent fields, and testimony from their own investigators describing the process of sample collection. Their argument was straightforward. Regardless of intent or history, the presence of their patented genetic material in Walter's crop constituted a violation, and the burden was on him to prove otherwise. Then it was Diane Ferris's turn. She began not with legal jargon, but with a story, the story of a family farm, a father who believed in self-sufficiency, and a tradition of careful, deliberate seed saving that long predated the very existence of AgriCorp's patented technology. And then came the moment that would define the entire case. Diane called Walter to the stand and asked him to bring the box. This is the moment referenced at the very beginning of this story, the moment that hushed the courtroom. Walter walked to the witness stand carrying a weathered cardboard box. Inside were dozens of envelopes, meticulously organized by year, the oldest dating back to 1968. Beside them sat small glass jars containing preserved kernels from select harvests across the decades, along with photographs, grainy, faded images of Earl Hensley standing in his cornfield in the late 1960s, shelling corn by hand in the barn and labeling envelopes at the kitchen table. Diane walked the jury through each piece of evidence methodically. She had the forensic document examiner testify to the authenticity of the paper and ink on the earliest envelopes. She had the independent geneticist explain in plain and accessible language how the seed samples from 1968 through the early 1990s showed a consistent genetic lineage entirely distinct from AgriCorp's engineered trait, a trait that, according to the company's own patent filings, had not even been developed until years later. Then she called Ruth Callahan to the stand, who calmly recounted trading seed with Earl Hensley in 1979 and produced her own family's handwritten records as corroborating evidence. Finally, Diane addressed the trace amounts of AgriCorp's patented gene found in some of Walter's more recent harvests. She brought in a wind pollination expert who explained, using maps and pollen drift models, how genetic material from a nearby farm, one that had legally purchased and planted AgriCorp seed, could easily have cross-pollinated with Walter's crop without his knowledge, consent, or any intentional use on his part. The cumulative effect was undeniable. Walter Hensley had not stolen anyone's technology. He had preserved, protected, and continued a family agricultural tradition that existed decades before AgriCorp's patent was ever filed. Any trace of their genetic material in his more recent crops was the unintentional result of natural pollination processes entirely outside his control. A phenomenon that, as Diane pointedly noted, AgriCorp's own patents and contracts had never adequately addressed or accounted for when pursuing farmers. AgriCorp's lead attorney attempted to challenge the authenticity of the older seed samples, suggesting they could have been altered or mislabeled. But under cross-examination, the forensic document examiner held firm and the geneticist's data remained consistent and unshaken. The jury deliberated for just under 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom was tense enough that, according to those present, you could hear the ceiling fan clicking overhead. The jury found that the evidence clearly demonstrated his seed lineage predated AgriCorp's patent by decades, that any incidental presence of their patented trait was the result of natural cross-pollination beyond his control, and that AgriCorp had failed to prove intentional or knowing infringement on his part. The gallery, packed with local farmers, reportedly erupted into applause before the judge could even finish reading the full verdict. For Walter, the moment wasn't about triumph over a corporation. It was about vindication, proof that his father's decades of careful, quiet work in that cellar had not been in vain, and that a family's tradition could stand up against even the most powerful legal machinery money could buy. The case did not end AgriCorp's practice of pursuing farmers over patent claims entirely, but it did send ripples through the agricultural and legal communities. Legal experts pointed to the case as an important example of how thorough documentation, historical record-keeping, and independent genetic testing could successfully counter even well-funded corporate lawsuits. Farming advocacy groups began citing Walter's case in efforts to push for clearer legal protections regarding unintentional cross-pollination. arguing that farmers should not be held liable for patented genetic material that drifts onto their property through no fault of their own. Walter, never one to seek the spotlight, mostly returned to quiet farm life after the trial. But he did make one change. He began giving talks when asked to smaller groups of farmers and agricultural students about the importance of record keeping, not just for the sake of tradition, but as a genuine legal safeguard in an era where the line between farming and corporate law had become increasingly blurred. He kept the cellar exactly as it always had been. The shelves still held those same aging envelopes, joined now by new ones added every single year, continuing a family tradition that had, quite unexpectedly, become part of legal history. When people asked him afterward what advice he would give to other farmers, Walter reportedly gave a simple answer, one that reflected everything his father had taught him decades earlier: never throw anything away. You never know when the past is going to be the only thing that saves your future. Walter Hensley's case became, for many in the farming community, a symbol of something larger than a single legal victory. It was a reminder that behind every corporate patent claim and every courtroom battle, there are real families, real histories, and real traditions, sometimes stretching back generations, that don't always fit neatly into the modern language of intellectual property law. His father's habit of carefully saving and labeling seed, envelope by envelope, year after year, wasn't done with any expectation that it would one day matter in a court of law. It was simply how farming had always been done, a quiet act of preservation, resilience, and self-sufficiency passed from one generation to the next. In the end, it wasn't a team of high-priced lawyers or a mountain of legal precedent that tipped the scales. It was a cardboard box full of old envelopes, faded photographs, and a lifetime of careful record-keeping. Proof that sometimes the simplest habits are the ones that end up mattering the most.